So our next session is a rules and regulations and policy update, right? So that's something that, as we've started to venture into this, and just to take a step back, this whole event started because we had a 1-hour workshop at the North Coast Wine Industry Expo in December of 2016. We were looking at, the legalization of cannabis and what that might mean for wine. What were the risks? What were the threats? What were the opportunities? And in the 6 years that we had been putting the conference together and trade show, it was by far the busiest workshop we'd ever had. It was like 250 people, standing room only. And we knew immediately that 1 hour was just not going to be enough time to address the questions that people had in the room. And quite frankly, there were a lot of questions that they were not able to answer. And so it's been interesting this is our third Wine and Weed Symposium, second one in Santa Rosa. We did one in the Central Coast, and every time we get together, the rules change a little bit more, but there's still a lot of questions that remain unanswered. So we're gonna see if we can pick off a few more of those questions today. We've got an awesome panel. If they don't know it, nobody else knows it either. So we're gonna get started. I'm gonna bring up our moderator, Jessica Strange. She's the Director of Operations for Soma Rosa and Cookies, California. Thanks, Jessica.
Good morning. My name is Jessica, and I'm so happy to be here with you. When they asked me to moderate the panel for rules and regulations, I thought, no problem, there'll be like 8 people in the room. This is akin to getting on an early morning Alaska Airlines flight and them offering you a Cabernet at 6:30. A little more than you expected, but I'm in. Let's do it. We're gonna bring up our wonderful panel, and this is no small potatoes that we're bringing up. These really are the industry-leading experts. Our first speaker is a premier cannabis attorney in the United States. She's not just smart, she gets it, she makes it happen. She is licensed to practice law in Washington, Florida, and California. The American Bar Association called her one of the top 40 young lawyers nationwide. She offers her perspective in legal analysis through Canna Law Blog and Above the Law, which happens to post all of its articles at 4:20 p.m. Please welcome Hilary Bricken. Our next speaker is a cannabis advocate stream with extensive experience in commercial cannabis growing and a background in politics and government. He is the executive director of California Growers Association and a champion of smaller farms, independent growers, working as a fierce advocate in Sacramento for the existing cultivation community. Please welcome Hezekiah Allen. And who's ready for the home team? Currently serving as senior counsel at Dickenson, Peatman and Fogarty. She's lived in Sonoma County for a decade. She served on Santa Rosa City Council, twice as chair of the Cannabis Subcommittee. And her efforts have helped to position Santa Rosa as one of the state's most progressive cannabis communities. Please welcome Erin Carlstrom. So I know that we have Slido, and it's super tech awesome, which I'm not. So we're gonna do a quick old-fashioned poll. How many people in this room know a lot about cannabis regulation? How many people know a little bit? Okay, everyone else, don't worry. It's super linear and crystal clear. It's gonna be fine. No questions. You'll all be experts by the end. All right, so let's find out where we are. Let's talk a little bit where we're at. We want to see an idea of where we're going. Erin, I'd like to start with you. If you could please offer a perspective on our local updates.
Sure. Oh, look at that. It worked. I wore the wrong outfit for microphone purposes. I apologize, so I have to be very analog right now. Hilary and Hez will have cooler microphones than I. Good morning. Where are we locally? It's a little foggy out there for cannabis regulations. City of Santa Rosa has been rather clear for a couple of years now, actually. The City Council, in its infinite wisdom, there is one of our standing City Council members here in our audience, Julie Combs. Raise your hand, wave, everybody. Thank her for her leadership on this. Santa Rosa City Council a couple of years ago unanimously decided that cannabis was an industry that we wanted to welcome. I had the privilege of being on the council at the time, and had the opportunity to work on the development of the robust regulations that we now have. Santa Rosa welcomes all cannabis businesses, retail, distribution, cultivation in the city if you can find real estate for it. Good luck, you're going to pay a premium. But it's a predictable entitlement process, which is unusual for cannabis. I think my co-panelists would agree with that. So welcome to Santa Rosa. We're thrilled to have you. Please do business in our city. Sonoma County is a whole other bag of cats. There's no other way to describe it. There's an ordinance in place. It was enacted at the end of 2016. But anybody in here got through the process? Yeah.
No, they're too busy doing paperwork.
They're too busy doing paperwork, Hez says. Exactly. Sonoma County has an ordinance that theoretically allows, again, for the entirety of the industry. But if you're trying to grow outdoors more than 10,000 square feet here in Sonoma County, good luck. You're going to be going through the planning department, and they're going to ask you to put in commercial grade driveways and ADA accessible bathrooms and paths of travel, and you're going to look at them and say, but I'm growing a crop. It's a plant. It literally grows like weeds. Thank you. We have to get the laughs out, right? But it's not working, essentially. It's a 1.5 old ordinance, and I think there's 11 permits that have been issued, all through the Ag Commissioner's Department, none of them through the Planning Department. So we're a little bit at sea.
Yeah, and it's important for us to talk about the local level because there's several stages of authorization. Hilary, can you walk us through maybe trends in the rest of the state? Who's really progressive? Who's less so?
Yeah, sure. So I actually got my start, just as a kind of a tangent, in Washington State when it legalized back in 2012. I can tell you now, regardless of the size of the market, the same things continue to happen from state to state. California is no different. We are in a period of massive growing pains. California has 482 cities and 58 counties. And really, through the esteemed wisdom of our governor with the trailer budget bill that passed in the summer of 2017, they are fully charged with police powers to regulate or ban this how they see fit. So from San Diego up to the Oregon border, we have different scenarios from city to city and county to county. I'm down in Los Angeles, and I'm sure many people are gonna give that an eye roll, because if you have not experienced red tape and pain, please come try to apply for a commercial cannabis license in our city. We are also instituting a social equity program. There are only about 4 across the entire state. That is gonna be really an interesting and democratic experiment. It is kicking off as of yesterday at noon in phase 2 licensing. So when we talk about cities that are more progressive, it depends on your licensing strategy. Do you want to be in a market that has high barriers to entry, that's extremely expensive for a very particular market share like West Hollywood, which talk about buying a property there, $26 million on average just to buy? Or do you want to be in a more turnkey jurisdiction with very low licensing fees where it's kind of a free-for-all that's going to be a hub for a particular license type? If you like that, down in my neck of the woods, those would be the desert cities. Even Indio is coming online with a bidding process. But the further north you go, the more progressive it is outside of the Central Valley. Modesto, Fresno, not super friendly. But when you come down to my neck of the woods, it starts to get really conservative and very strange with very interesting local barriers to entry, like residency. City of Hollister, basically, if you've ever been there, 50% of the ownership has to be a resident within the city of Hollister, and I know that they're not the only people doing that. But basically, and I'm sure Hezekiah can speak to this, and you too, Erin, the state is a bit of a pushover. They want to license everybody and anyone. They're in a fury to get the tax revenue. They want to get the experiment off the ground. The locals are the ones creating the barriers to entry. They are frankly oftentimes more restrictive than the state and more expensive to get through.
Hezekiah, so you're from Humble and you're currently working in Sacramento. Love to get your perspective on how things are shaping up statewide from that regulatory angle.
Sure. And first, thank you, George. You throw a heck of an event. You've done it once again, so it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of you for being here this morning. Wine and weed are literally two of my favorite things in the world. So always a good event to get out to. Things are going more or less as we expected. We're trying to take a globally known and established industry that's 4 or 5 decades mature, and we're trying to fit it into a state of 38 million. And so, I like to just mention some of the other commodities, ag commodities that California produces. Can you imagine, wine growers, if you could only sell your wine in California? How tricky that would be. And so here we are, California, the bread basket, the salad basket of the world, really. We've got great farmers, we've got great climates, we've got great genetics, great varietals. We've got pretty much everything we need, except for a regulatory framework that works. So looking around the state, Hilary mentioned that Los Angeles is full of red tape. It absolutely is. The worst part about it is they're one of 25 out of the 75 most populous cities that's actually doing something. So as bureaucratically challenging as it is, 75% of the 100 most populous cities in California still aren't issuing permits. So not only did we have to stop, or we were never really allowed to, but not only are we trying to fit this huge established industry into the in-state market, we're also trying to fit it into 25% of the populated cities. And of those 25, half of them still aren't even actually issuing permits. So things are quite challenging. Markets don't work if consumers can't buy products. And right now there really isn't a tremendous opportunity for consumers to buy and access those products. The good news is we're starting to make progress on some of the more egregious impacts that we dealt with. For me, this started in 2008. The river that I grew up knowing and loving in Humboldt County ran dry. Cannabis diversions weren't the reason for it, but they were certainly a significant contributing factor. And so, as we're looking around the state, we are starting to see it work in the communities that are regulating. What we're really, really not seeing is communities getting on board. That's the bottom line, and that's the challenge. So, I said this a couple months ago, and I'll repeat it. A good forecast doesn't reduce the severity of the storm. We are in the middle of the storm. We knew it was coming. We knew we needed to batten down the hatches. Some of us did, others didn't. We're getting through it. It's going to get better. We are seeing signs of improvement, but long story short, we had a huge unregulated industry, and things are changing. They're, in some cases, breaking, in some cases, growing. Incredible amounts of change, and that's sort of the nutshell of where we are, from my perspective.
The storm has consisted of a few versions of emergency regulations, and recently the proposed permanent regulations just came out. And what do you think about the process that we're in with the 45-day public comment period, our ability to participate and engage with our rulemakers?
I think it's great. I mean, for what it's worth, I'm a firm believer in democracy as being the worst of the worst, except for everything else we've tried. So far haven't really settled on a form of government that I love, but democracy works pretty rad, and it really relies on folks getting involved. And the emergency rulemaking process was very limited, and we could comment on constitutionality, public health and safety. We could comment on really immediate concerns, but we didn't get to have the opportunity to get into interpretation. Administrative agencies have tremendous interpretive capacity. Statutes are not always clear. Statutes sometimes disagree even. In the case of the cannabis regulations, there are internal inconsistencies and contradictions. And so a lot of what's going on right now is interpretation. And to have the agencies interpreting things in more or less isolation from the stakeholders, I think has been problematic. The flip side of that is the stakeholders are of very mixed opinions. We represent over 1,600 growers and businesses in the state at this point, and I can't get all of us to agree, let alone the other 3,000 businesses that we don't represent. So the stakeholder process is going to be challenging in and of itself, but I do think it's absolutely critical that we hear from the stakeholders.
Erin, did you want to share some thoughts on that?
Oh, sure. get three of us up here. We can talk all day. My only additional thought to Hezekiah's point is, this is a great opportunity for the industry to be sort of forced to engage, right, in this democratic development process. These are very quick timelines that we're talking about, 45 days to comment on 315 pages of proposed regulations from the various agencies. And to the question of, conflicts between them, I was just looking at them the other day, and, Cal Cannabis says, hey, if you happen to know, for example, that your product has been stolen or diverted, Cal Cannabis says you've got, I think, 48 hours to notify them. The Bureau, the BCC, says, no, you've got to do it in 24 hours. So which is it, right? Fascinating situation. And as attorneys, my firm, we're 50 years in the ag industry. We love regulated agricultural products. Wine, beer, cider, spirits. We love all of this. This is why we have a cannabis department that I have the privilege of leading. But there's no precedent. The rules haven't even been set, right? So it makes us very nervous. I live in a world of no. It is rare. I actually had the opportunity the other day, a client called, they said, can we do this? And of course my initial reaction is, oh God, no, don't do that, right? Don't do that. But I actually, went back to the regs, I read them through. I called the client and I said, okay, listen, I've been doing cannabis law for 3 years. I don't think I've ever had this response. I think you can do it. And they were like, what? I was like, yeah, I think we're okay.
Just say yes.
No, you can't. No, just say no. Mostly, this is not legal advice, but mostly say no.
Hilary, I'd love to get your perspective on this as well, but I also, are we normal? Like in other states, has it taken them this long to work out all the kinks?
The short answer is yes. This is going to take years to figure out, and anybody that's in a regulated industry of a commodity understands you are building your business on quicksand. Rules shift constantly. It's the statutes that are harder to change, but the statutes are typically broad. As Hezekiah said, they vest these agencies with wide latitude to fill the gaps with what they need to do to protect public safety, to regulate and enforce. It's very clear in California, and this is one of the ways that we are different. We have 3 agencies in play. At most in other states, it's typically just one leading the charge. And it's very clear that they're not talking to each other in a global way about the entire industry. They're very focused in the microcosm of these individual licensees, which creates a massive amount of inconsistency. And the other point is during rulemaking, or even when we have emergency rules, and anybody who's in regulated substances will know this, depending on the agent or the investigator that you get when you ask the question, you're gonna get a different answer pretty much every single day of the week. And that's when attorneys, clients, they need to push the agencies to get them in the positions that they want, because a lot of this is not codified in the rules. And if you want to hear some more stories, just let me know.
We want to hear all the stories. In fact, we're going to hang out here for the next 4 hours. Are you in? I think this is like the most juicy material ever. I'm going to take one question from the audience because we're talking about rules and it seems really time sensitive. There's a lot of confusion out there in the public. I get asked this quite often. Drug tests, employers and drug tests. It's like people thought because we said yes that all of a sudden that doesn't matter anymore. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I'm happy to. In fact, our employment group is here. Jen, our partner, Jen Douglas, is our employment group for DPNF. I've done actually a couple of presentations on, weed in the workplace and what does it mean, and it really boils down to one slide, which is you don't have any rights to it in the workplace. Nothing in Prop 64, nothing in the local regulations mandates your employer to allow you to have cannabis on your person, at your workplace, or in your system. Just like alcohol in that way. We can have an entire day's discussion on the sophistication of drug testing and its applicability in the workplace, but it really boils down to your employer does not have to allow you to have it on your person, at the workplace, or in your system. There's no ADA application here. It's not a reasonable accommodation that you can ask for. You know, and that's an area of law that certainly is developing, but very slowly.
Can I, and sorry about coughing into my mic. Usually I look down to cough on panels, but my mic was right there, so I won't do that in the future. I just want to, Erin said something that was, you know, you don't have any rights to cannabis in the workplace. And actually, I think there's sort of an underlying point here that despite all of the media attention that's been paid to cannabis and legalization and normalization, Prop 64 was actually a pretty regulatory heavy initiative. You know, this wasn't about freeing the weed. It wasn't about, you know, letting cannabis roam the streets or whatever it is that the prohibitionists may have been afraid of. It was actually about keeping the roadways safe, keeping it out of kids' hands, and you don't really have rights to it anywhere. You barely even have a right to grow your own plant in your own home. It's not a very liberal approach to legalization. You know, liberal not in the political sense, just in terms of there aren't very many liberties cooked into it. And I think that's important to get in our minds, because there has been a lot of hype about how California is going big and there's all this sensationalism. At the end of the day, this is a pretty conservative, moderate at best approach to legalization. And you know, the workplace is just one place where we're seeing that manifest itself.
A lot of programs that receive federal funding also are afraid to allow it because of sanctions involved there. Can we actually look at the federal shift that's going to be required for things to move forward in a less moderate way? Did you want to speak to that, Hilary?
Sure. Who knows what happened on January 4th of this year? Anybody? Okay, at least a few people, that's good. Our U.S. Attorney General rescinded all federal guidance on cannabis enforcement, including the Cole Memo that came out in 2013, which was bred from the legalization of cannabis in Washington and Colorado. This put some people into a tailspin, others really didn't care, because what Sessions says, and if you haven't read the memo, you should, it's a single page, is that U.S. attorneys are basically free to do their jobs. They always were. They're vested with prosecutorial discretion. We don't need any guidance on how to do our jobs, right, in these particular states. It is not a helpful memo. But what it does tell us is that U.S. attorneys have been fully returned to prosecutorial discretion to bust anyone for anything at any time, regardless of state law, which was always the case anyway. So I always ask this when I'm on a panel because I need to know, who knows, how many U.S. attorneys are in California? 4, okay? It's by far the most out of many states in the union. That's a lot of federal firepower. I know in my district, which is the Central District, when the Sessions memo came out, the U.S. attorney had not even been on the job for 6 months. Nobody knew how he was going to react and what he cared about. And as far as the other 3 go, everybody's been pretty quiet so far in the wake of this democratic experiment. What it looks like is that they have bigger fish to fry, obviously, under this administration, and they are still adhering to the Cole Memo principles. So hopefully California, in its rulemaking, because all of this hinges on this particular battle between the states and the feds, will pay attention to the Cole Memo principles regarding diversion, keeping drugs out of the hands of kids, not dealing with the cartels, et cetera. Pretty common sense stuff. But that does not mean that at any given time, any one of these U.S. attorneys cannot flip and change their mind if they have the resources, the manpower, and frankly, the political wherewithal. So it is still a possibility, it's on the table, that one of them can blow it up, start cracking heads in one district, but in another district, it'll be a totally different story where there's lax enforcement.
I just want to mention the Cole Memo was the reason why Prop 64 is so moderate, you know, and great pains went into the legislative process in 2014 and 15 to sort of comply with those requirements, and then again in the drafting of 64, that was sort of the shaping and guiding principles for California's legalization. There are a couple ways that things could get better at the federal level. There are a couple of ways that things could get worse. Cannabis policy will be changing in DC, and it could go a couple different ways. The good option is a very simple statutory shift. Just simply remove it from the controlled substances list, deschedule it, and allow it to be a regulated substance. That's what I think everyone in this room should be hoping for. There is also a rescheduling option. This could potentially be achieved regulatorily without Congress taking action, but realistically would require Congress to act. A Schedule II substance is still a very, very highly controlled substance. There's very little chance that we would see the amazing dynamism that Mr. Silver presented in that opening comment. Those things probably wouldn't prosper and flourish under a Schedule II or Schedule III approach. And so at the end of the day, we need Congress to act. We need a change to U.S. law on the subject. There are a few things, though, that I think are perhaps teed up for more rapid movement. We could see minor changes to regulations. Hopefully, we would see some of those regulatory guidance documents restored in some form. Opening up things like banking services could happen short of a statutory legal change. And so Washington, D.C. there are a lot of pathways forward, frankly. And, what we need is for everyone who cares about this to start paying attention and getting involved. We've made a lot of progress in California. Things are still pretty messy, but it is time for us to start getting unified so we can look to DC and start fixing some of the bigger, more fundamental core issues there, in my opinion.
And I should mention one more thing. FinCEN issued guidance in 2014, actually on Valentine's Day, telling financial institutions, if you want to bank the industry, this is what you need to do. Proceed with caution. That memo is still alive today, right? Because it's a DOT memo, not a DOJ memo, which is good because it tells us those agencies are not talking about this together. And the DOJ clearly did not tip off the DOT. And with time and its progress and the maturation of the industry, frankly, my opinion is it's way more important to have DOT on board than DOJ because banking obviously is hugely important basically to the survival of this experiment. So there is a silver lining in that the Department of Treasury is still online with that guidance for banking.
And having worked in another state's industry, I did actually get a direct deposit in Oregon. I got paid normally instead of a lovely wad of cash that I get now, which is fine. I feel kind of like a boss, but other states are coming online and they're finding ways, so there is hope. I want to just take a moment to acknowledge a little bit about the wine industry, and we're getting some questions about that. A question is, what can we do in the wine business to partner with those in the cannabis industry without putting our licenses at risk? Seems like a good local question to start with, Erin.
Sure. Well, again, just, what's that?
You said nothing.
Nothing.
Sorry.
No, the slide answer is nothing. If you're risk adverse, don't be in cannabis. So as I referenced earlier, our firm is 50 years representing the wine industry. This is a regulated ag product. But there's a reason that we're also representing cannabis, right? Because the corollaries are very clear. You need a strong corporate structure. You need great employment practices. You need to protect your intellectual property. At times, you will be in litigation. You're going to need heavy advice and counsel in your land use and regulatory and compliance areas. The wine industry, I think, is very uniquely suited and situated to transition or to diversify into cannabis because you've been through it all, right? You've all dealt with Department of Fish and Wildlife. You've all dealt with a mixture of local and state level regulatory issues. Luckily, in the variety of iterations of regulations that have come out over the last 3 years, and it's been, it's a series of revolutions, right? There was at one time a prohibition against holding both alcohol beverage and cannabis licensure. Luckily, that was removed. Unfortunately, what remains is a prohibition against selling them at the same location, right? So we have some great nationally recognized brands that we represent that really would love to be pairing cannabis and alcohol beverages because I think most people in this room would acknowledge that that's a really cool idea, right? But unfortunately, the regulations don't allow for it to the level of flexibility that I think we would appreciate.
Well, I think Bill invited us all to his house to have some, right? That's happening later, right? Okay.
Can I add to that answer?
Your lawyer says no.
Erin and Hezekiah are correct. Do not take an ownership interest. Do not become a financial interest holder, but look at the sidelines. Because everyone who is not going to Canada that's making any money in this industry that is making it is in the ancillary sector. What do I mean by that? You're providing goods, services, your time to these operators as they struggle through these beginning days. I highly doubt anybody in California is making a ton of money right now if they're doing this correctly for a multitude of reasons. But the folks on the ancillary side, the ones selling the Levi jeans, the pickaxes, the shovels, are doing quite well. And they actually can take deductions under federal income tax law. They can get a bank account. They don't have to pay their employees in cash. They can get institutional investment. So things like licensing of intellectual property, right? Joint ventures for other particular lines of business that are outside the industry, from swag to hardware to tech. This is still all on the table without implicating your winery or your license to operate as a winery or a brewery. That is really where the robust opportunities are, if we're going to be entirely honest, until 4 or 5 years go by in this particular industry.
This is there's no way we have time to talk about this, but I feel like it's important to bring up. We've got a few more questions, but I really want to talk about what's most likely to impact the wine industry. And it's not necessarily just cannabis, but rather the legalization of hemp. I mean, do we want to go there? Did I just open a box?
Hemp.
We need a whole
Hezekiah
day
loves hemp.
to talk about hemp.
Do it. There's a lot of hype about cannabis. That's part of the reason why the ancillary businesses are making so much money, is because there's more profit in the hype than in the actual product right now. That bubble will burst. This market is going to normalize. Folks that put good products on shelves are going to make it. But what there is real substance in my opinion, is the emerging hemp industry. At the risk of sounding like a pie-in-the-sky hippie for a bit of a moment here, you can do a lot of things with hemp. Hemp can, they've made airplane carbon composite equivalent frames out of hemp that are actually stronger than the latest generation B77s that are carbon composite. You can make fuel, both ethanol and diesel. You can make food. Anything you can do with an almond or an almond, if you're from that part of the state, you can do with a hemp seed. The crop is incredibly versatile. It takes about 30% of the water that most comparable commercial commodity crops take. It sequesters more carbon than most annual crops. There really isn't a downside to it, other than the fact that it looks really similar to and can crossbreed with a crop that gets you high that we decided was going to be illegal a while back. Hemp is still not legal to grow in California, but when it is, there will be, my estimation is several million acres of hemp planted very quickly. There's a lot of land that will be converted. You do see terpene cross-contamination between both cannabis and hemp, as well as wine. You do see operational considerations in terms of pesticide uses and pesticide applications. In terms of direct competition, or not competition per se, but in terms of, I'm not gonna go home on Saturday night and relax with a jar of hemp. A bottle of cannabis, or a jar of cannabis, or a bottle of wine. So it's a bit different in that it really is an industrial product. But in terms of, there's been a lot of concerns in Sonoma County, especially about competition for land and water. There isn't a competition for land and water with cannabis. We need about 3,000 acres statewide and a couple thousand acre feet of water. It's really not that big a deal. Hemp is a very different crop in that it could be cost competitive with wine grapes, and it could be grown on a lot of similar areas. And so I think that there will be more tension there. I don't think hemp's gonna displace grapes at the end of the day, though. I think it's gonna displace dead, dying, diseased, and dry almond orchards primarily.
So I'm just going to ask one final question of our panel. Seems most relevant. Are there new regulations in the works that you feel will make a significant impact in the future? And if so, what might we expect?
All right.
Fortune telling. Go.
I have one and only one, because I am wholly unimpressed by the proposed permanent regulations. It's just much more of the same kind of gap filling that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. But there is one rule that's going to set every city and county on fire if it's adopted.
That's a bad joke.
Statewide delivery, regardless of county or city border. That will change the game in the state of California. It will be the only state in the Cannabis Union that has such progressive access to the product. It would be a huge boon to the industry if it passes, but already in talking with city and county governments, I'm sure they're already doing this, but they plan to fight that tooth and nail, because you still have cities and counties that say, yes, use our public roads. We have to say that you can do that, but don't even think about terminating or beginning your delivery within our borders. And it completely hampers the meaningful access that we need to see the experiment work and to get all this tax revenue that we've been promised. So that to me is the number one impactful thing. I'm sure you guys have a different opinion, but for me, that's it.
Erin?
No, I mean, that's a great one. And as a former local policymaker, right, I mean, the whole premise behind 64 was that local land use control and police powers are vested under California's Constitution with the locality. And, you know, certainly in my practice, the patchwork of cities, even just here in Sonoma County, is we'll call it entertaining. How about that? It certainly makes for a busy practice, how everybody's regulating things differently and what are they banning or what are they allowing, even just here in Sonoma County. You know, more is happening in the city of Napa, for example, than in the city of Sonoma, where nothing is happening. Those of you who are following local politics know why I care about what's happening in the city of Sonoma. But I think Hilary, that's a really, really great one, really interesting.
I don't think there's any game changers proposed. I think it was actually somewhat pleasant that the proposed regulations were pretty consistent. I don't love the rules necessarily, but I love certainty perhaps more than getting my way. And so regulatory certainty is a very important thing. I know a lot of folks that are gonna figure out how to succeed as long as the rules don't change. I don't expect anything groundbreaking in the next few years, honestly. You know, since about 2014 when I started doing this full time, believe it or not, most of this has proceeded relatively according to the conversation. It hasn't been terribly surprising with one exception, but I'll leave that one off the table for now. What I will say is with 4,000 businesses, no matter what rule changes, there's going to be 30 people who think the sky is falling, or who it is for them. And so there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of outbursts constantly, and it sort of promotes this sense of anxiety. I actually think that sense of anxiety is really unnecessary. If you're in the business, try to get around that, try to look past it, and try to get to the core of what you're doing, focus on your business. And like I said, let's find some certainty, let's get some stability, let's build a 3-year business plan for the first time in our lives. I mean, living harvest to harvest is cool and all, but business planning is even cooler.
Well, and I will say too, just from a local perspective, I mean, anybody from Sonoma County Growers Alliance?
I mean,
Yay.
I count.
Okay, well, because one of the questions we have on Slido, of course, is about like local lobbying, and Sonoma County Growers Alliance is, of course, our local lobbying group. Wave your hand again. There we go. Here we go. Everybody who's interested in the industry should go and be involved. But like Sonoma County, right? I mentioned earlier, we've had an ordinance in Sonoma County since December of 2016. And one of the cool things that it does is allow locally for outdoor gardens of less than 10,000 square feet to get permitted by the Sonoma County Agricultural Department as opposed to the planning department. Why is this great? Because it's a crop, and the ag commissioner knows how to deal with crops. But you know, so what they said is, okay, maybe you have a 20-acre parcel, and you can get 4 permits of less than 10,000 square feet, or less than an acre, for example. And so enterprising individuals collaborated amongst themselves to submit multiple permits per parcel. Well, 8 months go by, and county counsel's office decides, hold on, wait a minute. For CEQA purposes, if there's any common ownership between those permits, between those applicants, we can't issue those through the Ag Commissioner's Department. You have to come to PRMD. So one of the cool things that the state regulations allow for, actually, is the use of a trust. And if you can put your ownership of a company into a trust, there are a variety of ways that sort of obfuscates ownership. So utilizing that here in the county, the Ag Commissioner's Department is like working with us really, really well. PRMD hates it. County Council is allowing it for now. But you know, it's a strategy that has been successful, but they're catching on, if you will. So as far as what's in the works and what's changing, it depends on who you ask.
As you can tell, we could go on and on and on. The schedule is going to wrap us up here pretty quickly. I'm going to ask one more question, if someone could answer in 15 seconds or less. As we inch toward public consumption, perhaps here next time at the next annual event, where are we at with AB 2020? Yes? You think it's going to go?
Oh, that's not the question I was going to answer, but Hez?
I don't like giving people bad news.
Okay, so we're going to keep hope alive.
Julie, are we going to allow public consumption at Santa Rosa events?
We'll find out.
For what it's worth, you can have events on fairgrounds, and there are a lot of ag commodities that started out through the fairgrounds. So this isn't unheard of as we bring a new commodity online to use the district agricultural associations and fairgrounds as a launch point. We do have a couple bills, AB 2020, AB 2641. We definitely need support on both of those. August 6th is going to be a big day with the Senate Appropriations hearing when they come back to session. So if you don't know, go to calgrowersassociation.org, events campaign, show your support for both of those bills. It's going to be big.
One last time, we've got Hilary Bricken, Hezekiah Allen, Erin Carlstrom. Please take time to talk with them today. They are a wealth of information. Thank you so much.
Great job, you guys. Jessica, thank you so much. You did a great job moderating. Super fun. So we've got a little break. Go fuel up, get some coffee, go visit some of our tabletop exhibitors, and we'll get back in here and kick off the next session at 10:30, everybody. Thank you.